Mabuhay, East Coast Filipino Portal. Thank you again for hosting us this evening. My name is Tanya Matthews. I am from ISANS, which is Immigrant Serving Agency here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So for those of you who are here in this area in Atlantic Canada, good evening. And everybody else, hello, whenever you get the chance to watch this video. So we've been presenting to you Thursday evenings for the past couple of months. And this evening is no exception in the fact that we are bringing you some really valuable information about immigrant serving programs within the ISANS, but tonight more specifically about resume writing and how to properly market yourself when you start looking for jobs here in Nova Scotia. If you are interested in looking in any other videos, there is tons of great information on our services, on our pre-arrival services, on services that are specific for those immigrants who are in the fields of engineering or accounting or finance or nurses or healthcare professionals. We talked about trades. We talked about working with youth if you are of high school age or a little bit older, but still looking for direction in your career and so on, as well as about our very so popular Atlantic Immigrant Loan Fund, because we do recognize that getting licensure and getting work in Canada and getting into your field occupation may cost some money. So we are going to put the links, I guess, up or down somewhere in the description, so you can definitely view other videos that we have posted. So I'm not going to talk too much in terms of introduction today because the content around resume writing is rich, it's powerful. The presenter is amazing in her own right. She knows resume, she knows cover letter writing. She has been developing a curriculum most recently for our engineers. So those who are in the field of engineering will be able to access curriculum developed by Cassidy. So I'm going to introduce Cassidy very quickly and know that this piece of information you get tonight is just a piece of a much larger workshop that you can have with Cassidy, and we call it JSS or Job Search Strategies Workshop, which covers way more than just resume writing and targeting. So our JS workshops are available pre-arrival. So if you're not in Canada, in Nova Scotia yet, you can actually start learning about our labor market, how to access labor market and how to market yourself. And tonight, Cassidy is just going to give you a little piece of lots of good information, lots of good advice on how to be competitive when competing for the jobs or the jobs that you really, really dream of having once you settle here in Halifax or in Nova Scotia. So Cassidy, feel free to take over. And for all the listeners right now, hello.
Yes. Okay. So, hi everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Tanya. As Tanya mentioned, my name is Cassidy, or just Cassie, as many people know me. And as Tanya mentioned, today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about resume writing. Now, this can be a topic that can take several days, or we can discuss in a lot of detail for a long period of time. So what I'm really trying to do is break this down to kind of summarize some of the key tips and areas to really help you put together and market yourself through your resume. So we are going to just quickly go over the breakdown of what you can expect to learn about for the next 45 minutes or so, or hour or so, and then we're going to get started right away. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about what a resume is and what you actually use it for, especially when applying for jobs in Canada. Then we're going to specifically focus on some of the key tips for creating a Canadian-style resume. So of course, I recognize there might be people tuning in from different countries and regions around the world. So our focus today is really putting together the Canadian style resume to meet employers' expectations here. We're going to take a couple looks at different samples and ways that you can adjust your resume when you're applying for specific jobs or different industries. And then we'll finish today by talking a little bit more about some of the programs and resources available to you through ISANS. At the end, there will be a little bit of time for questions as well. So if you do have some great questions that you think might be of interest to a number of the viewers this evening, please do feel free to ask, and I'll be happy to address some of those if we have time at the end. Okay, so as I said, today we are going to start off by talking a little bit about what a resume actually is. Chances are, if you are a working professional, whether it's in your home country or Canada, perhaps you've already immigrated, at this point, you probably do have some form of a resume. And as I mentioned, it's very possible that your resume might be catered to a different cultural market or might have some differences in the way it's presented than what's expected from the typical Canadian employer. So I called this presentation Marketing Yourself 101 for a reason, because a resume is really used as a marketing tool. Keeping in mind that oftentimes we are applying for jobs where you might not have had the opportunity to actually meet the employer that you're sending this application to. It's very possible they really don't know you as a person or what kind of professional you might be. And so this document, this resume that you're sending, really needs to do a good job of marketing who you are and your professional background. And so with this tool, what you're really doing is giving an employer an overview of a few different parts of your background. Now, the first part is your educational background as it relates to the position that you're applying for. So as Tanya mentioned, I know many of you are in the healthcare sector, many of you are engineers, some of you might be in more technical fields, some of you are looking for customer service jobs. So really your focus here with the educational piece is to highlight perhaps your studies, whether it's a university degree, a college diploma, or even specific courses you might have taken throughout your studies that are relevant for the job you're applying for. The next thing you want to highlight in a resume is the skills that are most important for the job you're applying to. And this could include people skills or technical skills that might be important for your job. And we're going to take a look at how we do this in a lot more detail later on in the presentation. And then finally, your experience. Now, we might have viewers this evening, or depending what time or where you are in the world at this point, we might have viewers that have a wide range of experience. Some of you might be new or recent graduates, and some of you might have already worked for several years in your field. So when it comes to choosing your experience in a resume, it's really important to highlight the experience you have that's, again, most related to the job you're applying for. And within all of the experience you have, with a typical resume in Canada, you don't necessarily need to include all of the work you've ever done. But again, it's really about being selective and choosing the parts of your experience that are most important and most related to the job you're applying for. And again, we're going to go through each of these components in a lot more detail throughout the presentation this evening. Okay, so with that in mind, I have sort of broken the presentation down into 3 key tips, and we're going to explore each of these tips in more detail. And I'm going to also show you some examples and sort of give you more important points to consider for each of the 3 tips. So overall, as I said, there are 3 important things you want to keep in mind when you're trying to format a Canadian style resume. Now, the first is to keep your resume concise. There are many cultures around the world that when you apply for a job, you might submit a document that could be 30 pages, it could be 20 pages, 5 to 10 pages. There are all different expectations in different cultural markets. But when it comes to a Canadian style resume, we typically recommend a maximum of only a couple of pages, maybe 1 or 2 pages at most. So again, I'm going to explain why that is in more detail shortly, and with that in mind, how to adjust or decide what actually goes into that document. Now, the second important tip is to make sure that your resume is formatted professionally and in a very neat and clean looking way. And again, I'll show you an example of this and talk about this in a little more detail. So how to actually format your resume professionally and in a way that looks organized. Now, finally, and perhaps most importantly, the last tip I will go into detail about shortly is the importance of targeting your resume. Now, this might be a new concept to quite a few people. And so if you don't know what that means at this point, don't worry, just hang on until later on in the presentation. And like I said, I'm going to go into a lot more detail, explain exactly how you target or adjust your resume for each application. And I'll also go through some samples and examples as I already mentioned. So let's start with the first tip, which is to keep your resume concise. Now, as I mentioned, in different cultures around the world, we see quite a range of page length, meaning in some places, an employer might expect quite a long document, even for people who are not very, very experienced in work. But in Canada, we typically say your resume should be no longer than 1 to 2 pages at most. Now, some of you might be wondering why that is, especially for very experienced professionals. And the short answer is because you really only have, on average, about 6 seconds to make a strong impression on an employer. Now, what does this mean? Well, a lot of studies have been done that look at hiring practices, and they look at how employers actually review resumes. And they also survey employers to ask them, on average, how long do you spend reviewing a typical job application or a resume, just to see if you might be interested in interviewing that person. And on average, the number that seems to be the most common is about 6 seconds. Now, that might be quite surprising to a lot of people. And so what that means is that if you have a very, very lengthy document or a very long document with several pages, obviously this makes it very challenging for an employer to find the most important information in such a short period of time. So again, think of your resume as a tool to market yourself. And if you're trying to market yourself effectively and you only have such a short time period, you really need to think about strategies and ways of presenting this document in a way that's going to catch the eye of an employer. Now, when it comes to reviewing your resume within such a short period of time, you really want to have an understanding of what that process is like for the employer, so that again, within those 6 seconds, you can really maximize the impression you make on that employer. So it is helpful to kind of understand exactly what goes on in that 6 seconds. Now, I've given you sort of the top 3 things that I think that you would want to consider in those 6 seconds. The first thing is that employers tend to quickly glance at the top half of the first page of your resume. So rather than looking at the entire thing, flipping it over and reading any specific part in detail, the first thing they usually do is glance at the first part of the first page. What does that mean for you? Well, that section of your resume should probably have the most important information for the employer. Okay, so we will talk about again and see an example of how to maximize that space for impact to really market yourself effectively for any specific job. The next important thing to consider is that employers will probably not read every single responsibility that you have had in your past jobs. So in your work experience section, when you talk about what you've done or what you've accomplished in your past, typically employers might only quickly glance at the first bullet, maybe the first 2 bullet points. So again, what does that mean for you? Well, those first 2 bullets or so should be the most relevant and the most important for the job that you are applying to. So you really want to keep those bullet points concise. I have seen tons of resumes with 10, 12, 13, 14, 15 bullet points just for one job. And again, if you know an employer is only spending about 6 seconds, I can almost guarantee you that they are not spending those 6 seconds reading all 15 bullet points from just one job. They do want a good overview of your background within those 6 seconds. So really take the time to focus the first bullet or two for each job you've held to really be important for the job you are applying to right now. Now, finally, within those 6 seconds, again, employers are really looking to understand the most relevant parts of your background, specifically how those parts of your background relate to the job they are looking to hire for. So again, from the perspective of the employer, they want to know how you would benefit them. They're trying to understand what you can offer the company and how they would benefit if they hire you. So within those 6 seconds, you really want to make sure that if you know employers look at the first part of the first page, if you know that they're not going to read tons and tons of bullets, well, you need to adjust your resume so that everything they are reading or quickly glancing at is going to be very relevant and will add value for them. Okay, now what else does this mean for you? Well, given the fact that you want to keep a concise resume within a page or two, what you really want to start doing is cutting out or taking out information that is either not relevant or perhaps very much outdated. So for example, if you're someone who has 20 plus years of experience in several roles and you're applying to a similar position, you really don't need other types of jobs early on in your career that might not relate to the type of job you are currently applying to now. So again, if your experience is very, very outdated and you've had more relevant experience recently, there's really no need to include, outdated positions you might have held 15, 20 years ago. Now, on a similar note, when it comes to sections, for example, like your education, it's very possible that you might have more relevant pieces of information to include. So for instance, if you do have a university degree or a college diploma, there's no need to take up space in your 1 or 2 page resume to talk about your high school diploma or some of your accomplishments in high school. At this point, your university degree is far more relevant than your high school diploma. So again, no need to include information that just doesn't really have a lot of value anymore for an employer, or perhaps is outdated. Now, again, I'll probably repeat and really try to emphasize this final point a few times in the presentation tonight, but one of the most important things you can do to keep it concise is include the information in your resume that is most important, meaning most relevant to the job that you are applying for. Now, as newcomers, or when you possibly do immigrate, if you haven't already, when you do immigrate to Canada, it's possible that some of you might A, switch your career direction, or perhaps B, start in more entry-level jobs as you go through something like the licensing process, or getting your credentials recognized in Canada. And so very often you will need to adjust your resume to really focus on the kinds of jobs you're applying to right now, rather than focusing on the jobs you might have held in the past in your home countries. So this is a really important point. It's all about showing the employer what is most relevant to them, not what might have been more relevant to a past employer. Okay, so that is tip number 1. Keep it concise. All of these important things to consider, where the most important information goes, how to create stronger bullets for the first maybe 1 or 2 points in your work history, and finally including just the most important and relevant information in each section of your resume. Now, the second and certainly important point here is to format your resume in a professional and neat and organized manner. Okay, so there are a lot of different things we can think about when we're thinking about how to format your resume. And again, I can spend an entire presentation just on how to make a resume look organized. but I'm going to try to sum up some of the key points for you to think about and consider. Now, one of the important points is to be consistent in your resume writing. And one of the examples of how you can do this, for instance, is to have all of the dates mentioned in your resume aligned, let's say, all to the right. For example, if you have several job experiences, having all of those job titles on the left. So you want to keep the formatting consistent. If dates are all on the right, they should all be lined up consistently. So what I'm going to do is kind of flip to a sample just so I can show you what I mean. And then I'm going to come back to these points. So here we have an example of a resume that is formatted in a really nice, neat, and professional way. It happens to be a past nurse who is currently looking for a job in administrative support. So what you'll notice here when I say be consistent, you'll see that the dates are aligned nicely on the right. All of these section subtitles are bolded and with all capital letters, and they are all found right in the center of the page. Now, it would look disorganized if, for example, one section title was in the middle, one section was to the left, one section was to the right, some dates were on the right, some dates were on the left. So just by first glancing at this document, it clearly demonstrates organizational skills. It looks nice, it looks professional, and there is consistency in how they're presenting information. Okay. Now, another important point when it comes to formatting your resume is to use standard fonts and styles. Standard font styles and sizes. So when I say standard font styles, I'm typically referring to a font that is easy to read, it's professional, and it's not too small or too large, right? So typically the standard font size would be size 11, especially for newer fonts like Calibri, Verdana, Helvetica. Those are three of the types of fonts that consistently employers tend to appreciate on a resume. So there have been a number of surveys, and through research and through conference attendance, it seems that a lot of employers seem to agree on typical fonts that would be easy to read and professional while still being modern and looking attractive on your resume. So as I mentioned, those are three of the ones that employers tend to really like: Calibri, Verdana, Helvetica. And again, size 11 tends to be the standard font size. Now, what you do not want to do on your resume is try to shrink the font so that it's so small that an employer cannot read it, just so that you can get more information on the page. Okay, so it's very important that the font is easy to read, it looks nice, it looks professional, and to the point of not shrinking it so it's so small, I'm also going to skip down to this final point here, which is to keep enough white space on the page. So again, flipping back, the standard for resume writing is about 1-inch margins. Now, if someone tries to shrink the font or shrink the margins so that the writing pretty much takes up the entire page, it's going to be very overwhelming for the employer. As soon as they open a resume that is all writing and no white space on the page, they're going to say, I don't want to read this. This is too much information. So just like you see in this sample, it's a 1-page resume. There's lots of white space. It's easy to see. It's easy to read. It's easy to find sections that are of interest to you. And it's easy to find important information. Now, another final thing that I want to mention related to the formatting is that you can use features to really draw attention to important parts of your resume or to specific key points. So you can use features as I've demonstrated here, like bold, like italics, like underlining different parts of your resume. In this particular sample, you might notice they use bold as well as all capital letters for each section title. And then for titles of, for example, their jobs in the past or courses or degrees that they have taken, that is again bolded. So you can use those kinds of features to really draw attention to separate sections, or even, again, key points in your resume that you really want the employer to notice. Okay? Now, overall, one tip that summarizes each of these points is that your resume needs to be easy to read and easy to find important information. So if, for example, the employer wants to quickly see your education, or if you have a degree in that field, it shouldn't be hard to find the education section in your resume. Again, this person has chosen to use features like bold and capital letters to quickly draw attention to the section titles. So it is easy to find that particular section, and therefore easy to see what kind of educational background this person or this applicant has. Okay, so overall, easy to read, easy to spot key important information. That makes for good formatting for a Canadian style resume. Again, think about constantly the fact that this is a marketing tool. If you're not marketing it in a way that's attractive or pleasant to look at, they're probably going to continue on to the next application. So that brings me to the final and probably the most complicated tip that we're going to discuss tonight, which is that you want to make sure that you target your resume effectively. Now, what does it mean to target your resume? As I said earlier, this might be a little bit of a newer concept to some of you. And so when it comes to targeting your resume, there are a couple of important things to consider. But first of all, what is targeting? Targeting means that you never submit the same resume twice. Instead, what you do every single time you apply for a job in Canada is adjust your resume so that each version of your resume best highlights the skills, the qualifications, and the experience that is needed for that job. So if you're applying to 2 different roles, assuming they require slightly different skill sets and different qualifications, the resume you submit for either job needs to be completely different, in the sense that in one of them, you will highlight the skills and qualifications needed for that job, and in the other one, you're going to highlight the skills and qualifications needed for the other job. So it is extremely important that every time you submit a resume, it needs to be slightly different to best match what that employer is looking for. And it's almost impossible to compete with other candidates if you are not doing this, okay? So in sum, every single version of your resume that you submit needs to closely match the job ad, or at least demonstrate the skills and qualifications from that job ad. So every time you apply for a job, you need to be going through and carefully examining the job ad of interest, and then going through your own resume to make sure it reflects the skills and qualifications needed based on that job ad. So we're going to talk about, again, how to do this, and we're going to see some samples. But first, you might be wondering, why do I need to do that? It sounds very tedious. It sounds like a lot of work. And the truth is, it is quite a bit of work, but the more you practice it and the more you get used to doing this, the more comfortable you will be with this skill. Just like anything, practice makes perfect. So why do you need to go through this process every time? There are a few reasons, and one of them is, again, that you only have about 6 seconds to make an impression on a typical employer. So that means that within those 6 seconds, if you have taken the time to really show the employer how you have the skills and qualifications that they're looking for, it's going to be much more obvious and much more convincing to that employer that you could possibly be the right fit for the job. Now, if you don't do that, if it's not clear to the employer if you have the skills or qualifications they're looking for, again, it's going to be very easy to pass you over and go on to look at the next applicant. Now, again, the second reason, sort of related, of course, but the second reason is that it's going to be much more convincing to an employer if they quickly glance at your resume and they see that you've actually put the effort into targeting and adjusting your resume just for the purpose of applying for this job. So they recognize the effort that it takes, and they will see, and it will be obvious if somebody has spent time targeting their resume. Whereas if you do not target your resume, in the same sort of way, it's going to be obvious to an employer that you really haven't put in that extra effort to show them how you're the right fit for the job. Now, finally, and also a really important point to consider, is that increasingly, especially larger companies, are using what we call applicant tracking systems, or ATSs. Now, this is basically a computer program that large employers typically use to quickly scan your resume, compare it to the job ad that they're looking for, and the computer program will actually determine how good of a fit you are based on how targeted your resume is. So typically, an employer will highlight some keywords from the job ad that they are looking to find in your resume. Those keywords will include the key skills, the qualifications, the experience that you need for this job. And so if they are not found in your resume, the computer program will basically say, nope, this person is not a good fit. Whereas if you have taken the time to include all of those key skills and qualifications, the computer is basically going to pass you on to the next stage for the employer to review your resume and application themselves. So sometimes when people tell me, I've applied to so many jobs and I just haven't been selected, that's why one of the first questions I ask is, are you submitting the same resume for every single job? And as soon as they say yes, is that a problem? It tells me that they most likely aren't even getting to an employer. It's very possible that a company is using an ATS, or an applicant tracking system, and they're not even getting to the stage of being reviewed by an employer. They're not even getting past the computer. Okay, so it's really important that you consider the fact that increasingly technology is determining who gets to the next phase, or who possibly can be interviewed by an employer. And so if you're not targeting your resume, you're really decreasing your chances of possibly being selected for an interview. Now, the next question you might be wondering is, okay, maybe you're convinced at this point that targeting a Canadian resume is necessary. Perhaps you don't know how to do that. So what I'm going to do next is just walk you through the steps that you would need to take in order to effectively target your resume. And then we're going to take a look at how to do this in different sections of your resume as well. So the first step, if you will, is to actually take the job ad and highlight the keywords from the ad. So you can do this in a few different ways. If you like to have a physical copy, you can actually print out the job ad, go through and highlight those keywords. If you're someone who prefers to work on the computer, you can copy and paste the job ad, for example, into a document, and then you can go through and highlight the most important keywords from the ad. And again, when I say keywords, I mean the most important skills and qualifications that the employer is looking for. Now, the next step is to go back to your general resume that you work with and add those key words or key skills and qualifications into your resume. So what you want to do is replace similar words or similar qualifications with the wording from the job ad. And again, one of the reasons for this is because of the applicant tracking systems that so many employers use. If you're not using the exact language from the job ad, even if you're talking about similar skills or you're using similar words, the computer or the applicant tracking system is going to look for the exact language from the job ad. So you really want to go through and make sure you're using the exact same wording. Now, an example of this is, let's say you are someone who might have worked in customer service. Let's say you're a finance professional and you're looking to work in the banking industry. Now, if all of your words say, excellent client service or very client oriented, and now you're applying for a job and the job ad says, we're looking for someone with amazing customer service, great customer service skills. Even the difference between client and customer could mean one person who writes customer will be recognized and one person who writes client will not be recognized by a computer. So even though they mean the same thing, they're both talking about client or customer service, you need to use the exact language reflected in the job ad so that you know you're going to be quickly selected by an employer. Now, the next thing you do after you've gone through and added in those keywords is really start to focus and draw attention to some of those key skills and qualifications that are needed for this position. So there are a number of ways you can do this, especially in that top half of the first page, where I mentioned employers tend to look first. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples later on, but one of the ways you can do this is using a section like summary of qualifications or a key strengths section. And basically what this is a summary section right at the top of your resume that really has basically all of the key information, all of the most important qualifications for the position right at the top of your resume. And again, it makes it very easy for an employer to just quickly glance and see that you are well qualified for the role. Now, again, one thing we know in terms of how employers review resumes is that they do not tend to read all of the bullet points in your resume. They might read the first one or two for each position. And so what you want to do is make sure you go back to your experience section, your work history, and you adjust your past responsibilities or accomplishments in order of relevance. Meaning your first bullet point needs to be the one that demonstrates that you've done similar work or similar tasks in your past job. So even if it wasn't the main thing you did in your last job, if it's now the main thing that is most relevant to this position, that needs to be the first bullet that you mention. Okay, so you want your bullets to be in order of how important they are for that job. And then, as I mentioned earlier, and in the spirit of being concise in your resume, the final thing you want to do is take out any experience, any skills or qualifications that are simply not relevant to this job, which I've mentioned already. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is show you a couple of different examples of how you might actually target your resume for a specific job. So what I've done is I've just copied and pasted the qualifications needed for a customer service representative job in the banking sector, as you see here. So on the left, you see the qualifications for this job. And what I've done is the first step in targeting your resume, which is to go to the job ad and actually highlight the keywords. So I've just highlighted some of the keywords to show you basically how this process starts. So you go through, you see, okay, what are the main things I need? You're not highlighting the entire section and copying and pasting it into your resume, but you want to start paying attention to the key skills or qualifications they're looking for. So just to quickly read over some of them, you see that they want someone with knowledge of how to best serve customers' individual needs, someone who has experience in social media, tablets, smartphones, online tools, and applications, someone who's comfortable helping people gain confidence in using these types of tools, someone who has knowledge of sales or banking solutions, someone who's committed to helping customers, a self-starter, someone who can collaborate as part of a team. They're looking for someone with interpersonal skills who can build rapport with their customers. And finally, someone who's able to effectively listen, solve problems, and who's good at responding flexibly to their customers' needs or challenges. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the best ways that you can target is going to specific sections of your resume and summarizing the most important qualifications for the job right at the top of your resume. And again, one of the reasons for that is because employers' eyes in those first 6 seconds go to that part of your resume, the top half of the first page. So what you can do is create a summary of qualifications section right at the top half of the first page that really demonstrates the qualifications needed for this job. So what I've done is basically adjusted a resume here. I bolded the key words from the job ad that we just saw. And now you can see how you can actually put this into a section of your resume to really highlight the skills and qualities that this particular company is looking for in their customer service representatives. So I won't read every single point, but I want to give you a couple of examples of how you might adjust some of the phrases or points in this section to really, again, target your resume effectively and market yourself to the employer. So let's take a look at this second point, for example. It says highly skilled at actively listening to customers, identifying concerns, and responding flexibly based on individualized needs. So again, I've highlighted some of the key words, and already just in one point, we have several key phrases from that job ad. Now, before targeting this particular point, it might have said great listener or excellent listening skills, able to help customers with problems and provide solutions, right? So you're basically saying the same idea that you're good at listening and you come up with solutions for customers' problems. But rather than saying it in that way, what you're doing is taking the keywords from the job ad and then you're targeting them so that in your resume, the language from the job ad is really reflected here. And again, this makes it very obvious to the employer that you've put in the effort to do that and that you really are clearly a very, very good fit for the position. Okay, so again, I won't go through every single one. I'll just maybe read over the next point. Again, if you're someone who's worked with banking products or you have experience in the banking sector, and maybe you've worked with tools like social media, tablets, applications, that was a very specific thing they mentioned in terms of what they were looking for. So you might add in a point that says something like passionate about promoting banking products and services and making technology accessible for customers of all ages, including social media, tablets, and applications. Now, again, in a typical resume, you might not specifically mention the different types of technology like social media, like tablets or applications, but because those are specific types of technology that they mention in the job ad, they are looking for a candidate who's comfortable in those areas. You want to go back to your resume and make sure you have those keywords in there. Okay, so this is just one sample of one section where already you can see there are tons of keywords added in, again, which will very much increase your chances of being selected either by an employer reviewing your resume themselves or by an applicant tracking system who might review your resume on behalf of the employer. Okay, so this is just one section, and already we have tons of keywords in just the summary of qualifications section right at the very top of your resume. Now, moving on, let's look at a different example because as I mentioned earlier, I know we have people in all different fields. So we just looked at sort of more of a banking sector example. I know we have lots of nurses and other healthcare professionals with us. So let's take a look at more of a healthcare role and how you might adjust your experience, particularly if you do have to go through a licensing process when you arrive in Canada. So the example I'm going to show you is for a nurse, and perhaps you're applying for something like a medical lab assistant while you're in the process of getting licensed as a nurse, or maybe other similar types of jobs in healthcare. So again, you might not be able to see, every single detail here, but what I've done is, again, highlighted some of the key words and skills that are required for this particular role. Okay, so I'm just going to read a couple of them from the top. The medical lab assistant is going to be performing venous and capillary blood collections. They need to be able to use Meditech, which is particularly a software for data entry. They need to be able to clean and sterilize a working area and equipment effectively. They need to, going down to the bottom here, be able to perform and learn computer functions. They need to be able to work well with others as a member of a team. They have to be organized. They have to have some experience in a lab. and they would like someone who may have experience in other languages. So those are just some of the key areas that I've highlighted here that they are looking for. Now, in addition to adding in something like a summary of qualifications section that we just looked at, you also want to go through your work history and actually target those points to the job you're applying for. Now, how do you do that? Similarly, you want to use the language that you see in the job ad. And when they ask for some specific things, if you have experience with those responsibilities or tasks, you can actually go into your resume and add those in a more specific way. Now, again, if you are someone like a registered nurse in your home country, and right now you're going through the licensing process and you're applying for a job like a medical lab assistant, it's very possible that you'll want to kind of rearrange the bullets as a registered nurse, again, to really highlight the parts of your background that's most relevant for this job. So let's take a look at how we might do this. Now, I've included sort of a before and after section here. Sorry about that. So before and after, here's how your work history might read before applying for a job. So before targeting it to this particular role, if you're applying for a nursing job or something like that, the first point might be worked with team of medical professionals to administer and follow up with treatment of patients, recorded patient histories to ensure easy and accessible reference as needed, drew blood, offered vaccines as needed, etc., right? So it's really about your duties as a nurse. Now, in this case, if you're applying for a job as a medical lab assistant, as we just saw in the job ad, the focus is a little bit different. It's more about specifically doing blood samples, but it's a lot of lab work. It's a lot of cleaning, sterilizing equipment, data entry. And so what we really want to do is shift the focus from really nursing duties to tasks you've done in your nursing job that were most related to the medical lab assistant role you're now applying for. So let's take a look at how, first of all, you might reorder those points and add in some of those keywords. So again, in this particular example in the bottom where you see after, these are basically the same duties that the person would have done as a nurse, but you can see that the bolded words are keywords from the job ad, and they're specifically targeting it to this particular position. So in this case, the first point says recorded and maintained patient histories and orders in digitized computer systems, including Meditech, ensuring accurate and accessible information was inputted in timely manner. So again, in the job ad, we saw it said they want someone who's used to working with digitized computer systems specifically, and who has used the software Meditech. Now, if you're someone who has that experience, adding in and being more specific about the type of data entry you did and what system you used is going to, again, stand out to an employer. Now, in the first section again, or in the before section, we saw that the person wrote, drew blood and offered vaccines. But in the job ad, they specifically used the terms performed venous and capillary blood collection. So rather than focusing on vaccines or drawing blood, you want to adjust the language again to really match that from the job ad. So you might switch it a little if, of course, you have performed those duties, and really highlight that specific task that you were responsible for, even if it's not the main responsibility as a nurse. If you did that in the past and it's now more relevant for this particular job, you want to go through and adjust in this way for your work history. So again, I won't read every single bullet here, but it's really just to give you an idea of how you can go through your whole resume and target or adjust each section to really best reflect the key skills and qualifications for the job ad that you're really applying to and trying to get into right now. Okay, so hopefully that does give you a good idea of how to effectively target. And before I talk a little bit more about additional services or supports you may have through ISANS, I'm just going to recap the key points that we talked about today. So there are 3 main tips that we discussed when it comes to putting together a really strong Canadian style resume. The first tip is to keep it concise. So again, you want to keep that resume within a page to 2 pages. You want it to be formatted professionally, and this includes a number of things like being consistent with how you align parts of your resume. It means using similar features for different sections in your resume, and it also means choosing a professional and easy to read font. Now, finally, we talked about the importance of targeting your resume every time you apply for a different job. And what this means is that you're going back to your general resume, you're adjusting it, and you're really using the language from the job ad to adjust your existing resume to really reflect the most important skills and qualifications for your target job. Now, when it comes to overall marketing yourself, each of these 3 tips or factors really make up just one piece of the puzzle, but they work together to help you market yourself successfully to employers so that you get noticed and invited to a job interview. So that's what I do have to say about resume writing. And before I leave you, I do want to just quickly mention some of the additional programs or resources we do have available through ISANS. So as Tanya mentioned, we offer a variety of resources. Many of them are specific to resume writing, and we also have far more in general that can help you in your job search. So first is employment counseling, which is one-on-one sessions available for people to work with a specialist who can help you in a variety of ways, but certainly to put together a strong Canadian style resume. We have job search workshops. As Tanya mentioned, I teach those, and they do cover a wide range of topics in your job search, including resume writing, cover letter writing, how to network effectively, and how to prepare for interviews. We have a job search resource center, which again is a professional who can work one-on-one with you to create documents for your job applications, for instance. We have a practice interview program where you can actually practice preparing for an interview. We have different programs that help you explore careers if you're sort of a youth or starting out and not entirely sure what career path you'd like for yourself. We have bridging programs, meaning programs that help professionals getting through the licensure process in Canada. For those of you who may have to go through it, like engineers or nurses or pharmacists. We have mentorship programs where another professional can mentor you and give you advice specifically in your field. We have professional practice programs where you can gain 6 weeks of Canadian experience, unpaid, but still extremely valuable in your field. We have on-site information and recruitment sessions, which gives you the opportunity to meet with, discuss particular jobs with different companies in Nova Scotia, and possibly get invited to an interview for that company. And finally, we have countless volunteer opportunities available for those who are possibly looking to give back to the community or even gain some valuable experience and skills in the Canadian market. So with that, I will leave you for this evening and give you the opportunity to ask any questions you might have. So first of all, I do want to say before I hand it over, thank you so much for tuning in and for watching for those who have. I do hope that this helped you in terms of having a good idea of what a Canadian resume should include and how it should be formatted and adjusted for each job. So hopefully you enjoyed tuning into this session and you got some useful tips. So thank you all for your time and attention today.
Great. Thank you, Cassidy, for this amazing presentation with tons of great tips. For somebody, I used to teach this kind of course as well, and I know how much, how challenging it can be to try and fit everything in 15 minutes. But I think if people follow those main 3 steps, that the resumes are going to be way more applicable to Canadian style, as well as easily read by potential employers, because it is looking for talent is like looking for we would say needle in a haystack. There are a few questions online if we have time. One of them is, can I include my student trainee experience to my resume? So sort of like I'm assuming things like work placement or student placement or internships or those kinds of things.
Yeah, good question. So absolutely. I would say, again, highlighting one of the things I mentioned is your resume is really an opportunity to highlight the most important or relevant experience that you have. And in this case, if you are someone like a recent graduate or a current student, very often it happens that you might have limited paid experience, but you might have really useful student internships or placements like you described. And even in cases where you might have some work experience, many people might work while they're in university in a job that's unrelated to their field of interest, just to kind of save or to make some money while they're studying. So if you have even unpaid work experience that's more relevant than some of your paid experience, we certainly see that happen as well. But absolutely, I would encourage you to include that really valuable experience on your resume, even if it's unpaid or even if it's while you were a student.
Cassidy, there was another question in the chat box from an engineer who completed a bachelor degree and then a master's degree, but he's been finding it really difficult to find employment. And you have worked on the job search for engineers lately. What advice can you give him?
So difficult to find work. I mean, I would need a little more information.
Yeah, he's a new graduate, considered a new graduate because he never had any work experience. He lives in Ontario, and I believe that he's facing difficulty getting into employment. And what I'm seeing here, that he had 3 instant call interviews and he failed to express himself. So
yeah, okay. So first of all, if you have the opportunity to clarify, I'm not sure. I'm assuming the person studied here, Moja. Do you know that?
Bachelor's from overseas, master's from Canada. But I think the main point here is, what advice would you give to somebody who's a new graduate with very limited, if any, experience?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, it could be if you've had interviews, it seems to me that it's possible that maybe your interview performance seems to be a little bit more of a challenge than actually getting recognized, because clearly employers are interested in possibly hiring you if you've had several calls for an interview. So that's already, a great first step. One thing you might want to do is take part in practice interviews just to kind of really be able to communicate your skills effectively. And specifically in a field like engineering, which is so technical, you really need to find the balance between demonstrating your technical skills effectively and using a lot of the language and vocabulary that they're really looking for related to some of those engineering competencies. But you also need to demonstrate good people skills, because you are going to be working with others. You're going to be working in a team. So you really need to find that balance in a way of demonstrating your technical and people skills. And this is something that a lot of people find challenging. Many times we see engineers who are really good at expressing their technical ability, but they don't really have great interview techniques or communication skills. And many of the engineers that I've surveyed or spoken to about the interview process have said it's surprising them how much non-technical skills are also valued in Canada. So those people skills and really those interpersonal and communication skills, especially at the point of the interview. So that's what I would recommend, doing some practice and really trying to come up with some compelling examples, even if it's through projects you worked on in your master's or courses you've taken, some really compelling ideas that you might contribute to the engineering field, or examples that can demonstrate your technical knowledge, but also times maybe where you worked with team members on projects throughout your studies, whether it's your undergrad or your master's degree.
Another question, when saving or sending, I would add that to the question, your resume to employer, PDF or Word?
Oh, this is a good one. We get a lot of questions, should you submit a Word or PDF document? If an employer doesn't specify which one they prefer, because some people will specifically say, please submit a PDF document or please submit a Word document. If they don't specify, I typically say a PDF document is better. And I have a specific reason for that. The reason is because if you're working on a certain computer, and we talked about one of the main tips today being formatting effectively. So if you spend all this time formatting your resume perfectly, and let's say you're working on an Apple or a Mac computer, and then you submit your resume to someone who has a PC or not a Mac, a different kind of product that you than what you have, it's very possible it could completely affect the formatting. The dates could be all over the place. It could really influence the way it reads to the employer. So for that reason, when you do a PDF version, it protects the formatting and you ensure that it's going to present in the same professional and organized way. So I typically say a PDF. If they specifically request a Word document, I always suggest trying to open it or asking a friend or a coworker or a family member who has a different type of computer to open it up just to test to make sure the formatting is staying consistent on other computers.
That's a great tip, especially because some employers would actually specifically request your resume to be emailed to them either as a PDF or a Word. So you should follow the instructions in the job ad as well. Another question, actually, I'm going to merge two questions together. One is about a little bit of graphics in the resume. And I want to add to that, what about fonts in a different color other than black? So a little bit of creativity in a resume.
Yeah, that's also a really good question. That's something I think a lot of people might have different views on, but having a lot of discussions with employers and other coworkers, we tend to agree that having all black font for almost everything in a resume except small parts could be acceptable. And when we say maybe one other color in your resume, it shouldn't be like your work experience, but maybe in some sections you have something underlined or you have a small graphic. And one kind of interesting marketing strategy we talked about is maybe using the color or the color of the brand of the company you're applying to. So if you know that, a company you're applying to is like a royal blue brand, maybe you specifically use royal blue to just underline different sections, or you have one, your name or just one part of your resume in their company color as a very intentional choice. But other than that, I would not recommend, having a bunch of different colors. I wouldn't recommend having colors that are difficult to read, like a yellow or a very light color. So using one color that might be a company choice would be okay. Now to the question about graphics, as I said, something like underlining in a color that might be the brand or the logo of the company would be what I would recommend if you're trying to be a little more creative. In terms of putting like a picture or something, many times I have actually received resumes that had little graphics or images pasted on. And going back to the issue of formatting, what ended up happening several times was the photos end up in different places on the resume. They might not be where you actually intended them to be if you're submitting a Word document or if you're sharing it in a Word document rather than a PDF. So again, I always caution people with using graphics because it can really change in terms of how it's presented when someone else opens it on their computer.
Yeah. Can I just add, unless that is your field, if you're a graphic designer, then your resume is expected to be a little bit more creative than just a plain 1-inch border and everything else. So for sure. But for everything else, everybody else in the fields, standard Canadian sort of boring resume should work very well. There is a repeat question on how many pages for a resume. We said no more than 2 in our presentations. Another one is in terms of, this is a good one actually, if you can go back to Joey, mentioned that the Canadian resumes, there are no photos.
Yeah, that is a good question. I get this a lot. So, having applied to jobs overseas and particularly in a lot of or looked into opportunities in Asian countries, I know that it's a standard practice to include a photo on your resume, and in several cultures. Absolutely not the case in Canada. It would be a kind of strange thing for a Canadian employer to see a photo in your resume. And one of the reasons for this is actually simply because of the possibility of discrimination. So typically, hiring practices are supposed to be based strictly on your qualifications as they relate to a job. And there's always a risk that if you include a photo, this is an opportunity for someone to make assumptions or even if they don't mean to, potentially discriminate against a standard practice to include a photo. And I would tell you not to do so. However, there are always ways that an employer can search you and see what you look like if you use a platform like LinkedIn or other forms of social media.
Yeah. Another question just popped up. It's just to add to that. Definitely do not include anything related to gender, religion, status, and so on. Literally name, address, contact information that is as personal as you can going to get. Couple of other questions, lots of great questions. So how about live links, videos, or maybe links to, I don't know, LinkedIn account or portfolios online, things like that?
Yeah, I definitely recommend including links in underneath your contact information. So let's say you have your name, your address, your phone number, your email. Then I would typically say after that to include a live link to something like a LinkedIn account if you are an active user and you have a good online presence. For those of you who do have something like an online portfolio, so returning to the mention of some of those more creative fields, like those of you who may be in graphic design or architecture, it's certainly common practice to have an online presence like a portfolio to share with employers. So in those cases, I definitely suggest including the link to that. In terms of a video link, I would say if it's relevant or somehow related to the job. So I don't know if you're like a teacher or a professor and there are links to you doing a lecture. That would certainly be an example of some kind of relevant work and them being able to see you live in action. So certainly if you have a video or some kind of representation of your work, you can include that. And if you have something like a LinkedIn page, I would also say don't be afraid to include photos and videos in there of you actually, in the process of working as well. Is LinkedIn?
Thank you, Cass.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Is LinkedIn helpful? It's pretty much, I think, at the point that it's a must. You should have a professional profile on LinkedIn. Maybe a question for Moja, if we can. There was a question online about, do employers in Canada actually hire outside or pre-arrival?
Yes, of course. Especially if you are in the process of immigrating, or if you have the skills required for a specific province. For example, in the Atlantic region, there is an Atlantic immigration pilot project. And there are specific occupations that are needed in this region. So please look at the jobs posted through the AIP and the employers who are designated employers to bring people in from different countries and apply. Employers are open to receiving resumes and they can connect with you directly, and then you can start, of course, once you get a job offer, you can start the immigration process. And if you started the process of immigration and you are working with us through ISANS or through any immigrant serving agency across the country that provides pre-arrival services, you can you can start the job search process. You can work with them on the job development process. They can introduce you to employers, and of course, with the hope that you will get a job or the job offer before you arrive. We had so many situations when the employers interviewed clients through Facebook or through Skype for Business, and they offer them jobs to the point that they arrived for a job waiting for them. So it's just all about preparation and doing everything in your power to become job ready.
Thank you, Moja. Any other questions? I went back to check to make sure we didn't skip anything. I hope everybody got their questions answered. Last call for last question, because this was a great presentation. Oh, there is a question about character references.
Yeah, so this is something that won't go on your resume. I actually just saw a really great post today on LinkedIn. So again, if you are a job seeker using tools like LinkedIn, you can find a lot of great job related information. So one of the things I saw was there's really no need to include anything in your resume that does not add value. And so at this point in time, people will ask for references at the point of the interview. And so there's really no reason to have it on your resume saying something like references available upon request, or even including the information of your references. Because in the Canadian context, it's assumed that if you're invited to the interview, you'll have to provide your references. So there's really just no reason, when you only have a page or 2 pages at most, to waste space on including, any information related to references.
And how important are cover letters?
I would say very. In any field, even when they make it an option, I always say you should really use any opportunity at all you can to give yourself an extra advantage. So a cover letter is different from a resume in the sense that you can make it more personal. You can elaborate on different parts of your background rather than just giving one bullet. And more importantly, you get the opportunity to kind of show a little more of your personality and perhaps your passion for what you do, which really is difficult to come across in just a resume where you're summarizing your background. So anytime you're applying for a job, whether they require it or they just say it's an option, you always want to submit a cover letter as well to really further your candidacy.
Perfect.
Cassidy, there is a question. It's here in our chat box. The client is saying, if we edit our resumes for different jobs, and then they also ask for LinkedIn ID, what if they don't find similarities in LinkedIn account and in my edited resume? And what if the edited resume for that particular job and LinkedIn account does not match, because majority of employers also ask for LinkedIn?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This is one I get all the time. The short answer is it's a common and expected Canadian practice to target your resume. So when you're applying for a specific job and an employer receives the application, typically they should understand the fact that you have targeted and you have adjusted this resume to best highlight your skills and your qualifications for that job. Now, if you are applying for the same type of job consistently in Canada, you probably also want to slightly target and adjust your LinkedIn account. Obviously, it's not going to be expected that you target your LinkedIn on a daily basis and change it and update it for every single job you apply to, but it should generally be targeted towards the field you're trying to get into at this point. Now, an employer is not going to penalize you if, for example, you highlight a bullet point that's different here than in your LinkedIn account, but it's still important on your resume to be truthful. So even though you're targeting, that doesn't mean you're being dishonest about your background. It just means you're being strategic. It means you're taking the most important parts of your background and highlighting it for this job. So your resume is highly targeted to one job. Your LinkedIn is more a general online presence. While it should be targeted to your field, it's not realistic that employers would expect you to target it for every single job you apply to. So, of course, as long as you're not dishonest in your resume, I would say it's not a major concern if one is targeted and your LinkedIn is a little bit more of an overview.
Okay, great. Sorry, there are some other questions that we have covered, so please free to watch our video recording after we wrap up here. Is it better to position yourself as a generalist or specialist in your resume?
That's a good one. I would say a specialist to the job you're applying for. So it depends what job that is. If it's something like you need to be well-versed in all accounting practices, you want to really demonstrate your ability to do all accounting practices. If you're applying for a job that's something very specific, like accounts payable specialist, you really want to focus on your accounts payable experience and highlight that you're an expert in accounts payable. So really the overall idea is you are a specialist in the job you are applying for, and you're highlighting the skills and qualifications most relevant for that job. So it should come off like you are an expert, or at least you're able to do that job very well. Obviously, you're not going to be like an expert or specialist if you're a current student or you're just graduating. You might kind of be more geared towards an entry-level job, but no matter where you are in your job search stage, it really needs to be targeted to that specific job.
And what is your advice if clients have results for any type of a language test? Should they include it, and where? Resume or cover letter?
I would typically say if it's a job or a specific role that asks you to include this information, like for example, if you have gone through a licensing process, you're applying for something in the healthcare field, and they specifically say you need to have an IELTS score of 7+, just as an example, then I would typically include that in your resume, specifically in the resume. Now, if it doesn't ask you for a specific test or skill, but it just says something like excellent communication skills in English, I would highlight your communication skills, but I wouldn't specifically give a score if you're applying for, just a typical skilled position that doesn't require, proof of language or something like that.
I agree.
There was a question. Yeah. There was a question about someone saying, I just got in. What about criminal record check? Is it required all the time?
I mean, usually, yes. It is typically required to submit a criminal record check. It's not usually required as soon as you are invited to an interview, but usually if you are being considered for the job, they might specify that you will have to submit a criminal record check. So most, I would say almost all, if not all, jobs, including volunteer work in many cases, do require a criminal record check in Canada.
And there was a question earlier about should I include my religion, age, gender?
So, yeah, I think we got to that one. We said definitely no. Nothing,
okay.
no factors. Really focus on your education, your experience, your background as it relates to this job, but nothing personal that doesn't relate to your ability to do the work.
And one of the questions, what is the worst resume mistake ever? I believe that there are so many mistakes. So.
Yeah, I think there are so many. I definitely agree. It would depend on sort of the hiring practices of that company. If you're using an applicant tracking system, I would say the worst mistake you could make is not targeting your resume, because even if it's really nicely formatted and it looks really neat and professional, if you don't have those keywords, you're really not going to get to the next phase of the interview. If it's an employer looking really, really quickly, I would say at first glance, as soon as you have a really disorganized or unprofessional looking resume, they're probably not going to look further, even if you did target your resume. So it depends if you're writing to a human eye or a computer, but both of those are really major mistakes to make. So you want to take into account all of the tips we talked about today.
I think we talked about the keywords, so please watch the video again.
Yeah, if you rewatch the presentation, you'll be able to kind of get a really clear demonstration and understanding of what keywords are when it comes to a job ad, how to find them, and then how to implement them into your resume as well.
And as an employer who hires, I think one of the things that's very easy to spot is resume that hasn't been given any attention, that it was just sent in to send it, and maybe something comes out of it, as well as coming to an interview unprepared. That's very easy for employers to pick on those kinds of things. So job search is a full-time job, and it does require lots of work. But if you do follow Cassidy's instructions, we feel and we have seen results where very small number of applications will result in a equal number of interviews. So please do spend time targeting your resumes. I think this is it. Thank you very much, Cassidy. Thank you, Moja. For all of those who are coming in late, please go watch the video because it was great and informative. You will learn a lots of great steps on applying for Canadian job market. So see you probably next Thursday. And just to let you know, next Thursday we have a guest from our business team. So they will be talking about the services they offer pre-arrival. So to those immigrants who are interested in actually coming to Canada and opening a business and not necessarily looking for a job. So lots of good information coming your way on Thursday evening. Thank you again, East Coast Filipino Portal, and thank you all listeners.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you
Have
all.
a great evening.
Have a good evening.